Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like you to put your hands together and give yourselves a big round of applause for your presence here today. I'm so super excited to share with you for just a few moments on the theme of the courage to dream. The courage to dream. I think it's so important in this day and age that we find the space to dream, that we find the courage to have a prophetic imagination, to think beyond what is, and to begin to imagine what can be. Because if we stay where we are, we know where that leads, right? We know that the 2020 pandemic and the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, in fact, they're doing the deliberations today, concluding the trial involving the death of Ahmaud Arbery down in Brunswick, Georgia, where thousands of pastors gathered yesterday on the steps of the courthouse to protest. We know that if we stay where we are, then the road leads to nihilism. More streets will burn. More communities will be devastated. More hearts will be broken. And we will continue to live amid the challenge of racial hostility and the struggle to build a meaningful, loving community for us all. So I believe that this is a time to dream. I think that this is a moment to imagine the possibilities like never before, to move forward, to think imaginatively, to look at your own dreams, because we all have dreams. We can be honest, right? We all have our own individual dreams for our families, for our communities, for our churches, for our nation, for our world. But how can we learn how to dream together? I want to begin by just talking a little bit about my own story. The fact that I'm standing on this stage this morning is a miracle. It's a miracle because I can't divorce my presence on this stage, Dr. Brogdon, from being a black boy growing up in southeast Georgia on the edge of an old plantation in the belly of the South, where my father was a sanitation worker, not unlike those that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. marched with down in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968. My mother cleared bedpans for the sick and dying in the city's nursing homes. For much of her life, she served. She made the world better. My father did as well as a sanitation worker. I remember going with him on many days as he took pride in his job as a sanitation worker to help the city run better, to help communities move forward in a humble, gentle, and honorable manner. We learned about that during the pandemic, didn't we? About the power of frontline, essential workers, and how the concept of essential workers became front and center, because we're told that somehow those who are powerful are most important. But what we learn about the existential condition of our lives is that the first perhaps shall be last, and the last will be first. Can we give ourselves a round of applause for recognizing that we're learning something in this time? I've had the privilege of marching and protesting and working alongside of Black Lives Matter workers, but then going to church on Sunday morning and preaching to congregations in both urban and rural spaces, and noticing the challenge that we certainly have in the present moment. See, my story is a story of black pain. Sure, I could talk about the complex nuances of nihilism and ecclesiology and soteriology and all of those concepts. But I want to share with you a little bit about my story. You see, as I shared, I was raised on the edge of an old plantation in the belly of the South. I grew up with 7 amazing sisters and a large extended family. We were poor, but we were loved. We had a community that nurtured and formed us. And in that small little town in southeast Georgia, there were two churches. There was the little church that I grew up in, Mount Moriah Missionary Baptist Church, where we'd sing songs like, "We've come this far by faith, leaning on the Lord, trusting in his holy word, can't turn around now, we've come this far by faith." I left that town, joined the Army, where I spent 4.5 years, a year in South Korea serving this nation, and then attended Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, where I was introduced to Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and work. So it led me to this stage today, friends, to talk about the courage to dream. And I'm inviting you this morning to dream with me. I'm inviting us to have the courage to dream the impossible dream, the dream that led Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to give his life for the cause of freedom, justice, and human dignity. And to begin to imagine black bodies as sacred space. To begin to imagine for just a moment the idea of black bodies as sacred space. Maybe it sounds novel to some, but we live in a cultural reality, a world that has been immersed in white supremacy, white nationalism, and nihilism, that often polices out the concept of black bodies as sacred space. Sacred space as a space that inhabits the Holy Spirit, and that God's presence and the activity of God unfolds in those spaces. The story of Jacob Blake is an example of the struggle. Breonna Taylor and many others that marginalizes and suppresses and dehumanizes black life, that sometimes renders black life as meaningless, as devoid of purpose and significance and stories. So we have an opportunity, friends, to think about black pain not as a foil, for working through our own moral imagination, not as a sort of means to simply reckon with our own struggles with racism or with sexism or with violence, but to reckon with black pain as an occasion to think critically about God's presence, God's healing, and God's transformative wisdom in our lives. I'm going to talk a little bit about an awakening of the dignity of black life today with the Black Lives Matter movement, that black life is a gift to humanity, and that finally we have to find the courage to dream. First of all, and I don't have very much time, black bodies as sacred space is a challenge to evangelical Christianity. We all know the history of slavery, of colonialism, Jim Crow segregation, Reconstruction. But one of the challenges we face with the evangelical church is to really reckon not only with the reality of race, but finding the courage, the moral imagination to take action and to take steps to go beyond the horrors of the past, to imagine a possibility of a great, powerful future. Well, one of the reasons why we have to deal with the reality of black bodies as sacred space is because it disrupts the narrative of white supremacy. It's very hard, I think, for some of us to talk about white supremacy, but it is a reality that we're shaped and formed in. I remember growing up as a small kid down in rural Georgia and seeing the disparities up close and personal. I could see on a daily basis the black community, folks who worked the most difficult, challenging, dirty work of society, where our white counterparts had the more powerful positions. So from the time we're children, we are internalizing these coded messages about race, racial categories, bodies, and how we interpret black bodies as well. It becomes a contestation with empire and with nihilism. And this is the part that I get excited about, is because black life refuses to give up. There is a continuation of hope in the midst of hopelessness, of joy in the midst of pain, of laughter in the midst of struggle, that there is a persistence for life, for justice, for freedom, and human dignity for all. Black pain and the struggle for human dignity reveals that we can learn so much from the black struggle about how to deal with our larger cultural problems related to nihilism. Because guess what, friends? It's not just black folks that are struggling with nihilism. We have a cultural problem with nihilism. The Pew studies that came out in 2014 and 2019 revealed the problem of young adults between 19 and 30 who are dramatically and profoundly leaving mainline congregations. That in a real sense, white congregations and black churches will be empty in 10 to 20 years. And so if we don't address this deeper perennial problem of nihilism, of meaninglessness, of hopelessness and despair, then we will all suffer a very, very tragic end. But black life can teach us so much about how to not give up, about how to stay true to your purpose, about how to be persistent in your vision, in your hope. One of my favorite lines from Dr. King is when he would say, "I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight," he said this in Memphis, Tennessee, the night before he died, "I may not get there with you, but I want you to know that we as a people will get to the promised land." We all have a dream, friends. Let us dream together. I remember standing on the steps of the state capitol in Raleigh, North Carolina. This was during the pandemic, just weeks after George Floyd had died and been killed in that gutter. And I recall seeing thousands, probably close to 10,000 people from all walks of life coming together, black and white, rich and poor, Jew and Muslim, young and old, grounded in this idea and this principle of human dignity, that all life matters, and that there is a sacredness in the life of black men and black women. And that if we can learn to appreciate the lives of the least of us, then we can honor the lives of us all. As I conclude, friends, I believe there's an awakening in our midst. The Black Lives Matter movement has shown that there is a passion, there is a drive, there is a determination, there is a persistence that will not be deterred. And even though it may have appeared for just a moment, a glimpse, and then somehow settled down, the fact that we've seen it at work is a revelation of what's possible. That across this nation, from East Coast to West Coast, in nearly every town in the nation, there were protests, outcries of indignation in the presence of the inhumanity to a human being. We're now so connected with social media that it has given us the capacity to connect and to have access to information that we've never had before. Perhaps it becomes a gateway to dismantling multiple systems of oppression. As I conclude, friends, I just want to ask a question. Do you have the courage to dream? Do we have the courage to dream today, to not get satisfied with what is, but to really begin to work to see what's possible, not just for this generation, but for the generations to come? Let's dream together, friends. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. That was a compelling presentation. I want to do just a brief follow-up question, if you could give us just maybe a 30-second response. Because to me, one of the gifts of the Black faith tradition is that, for example, it gives us language to give voice to things. So whether it's drawing on Scripture, or whether we are creating spaces that are safe for us to be who we are. How has the Black church been either giving language or providing space, to address those issues of pain? How have you seen that either in your work or in your research?
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a really compelling question, and Kelly Brown Douglas made some really powerful points last night when she talked about churches as sacred spaces of safety, security, and not just spaces of safety and security, but spaces of transformation, spaces of inspiration and hope and renewal for the struggles that they encounter in their lives. That's been the case historically, where Black churches were not only spiritual institutions, but also social, political, economic resources as well. And I think to address these problems of nihilism, to address these issues related to racial hostility, racial injustice, means going beyond just simply the spiritual needs of folks, but really recognizing that we are multidimensional, complex beings that have a myriad of different needs. And the Black church has been, and in many spaces continues to be, resources for all of those different needs that folks encounter.
Yeah, I'm going to want to press a little bit more in the second hour on some of those issues, because to me, one of the disconnects with the contemporary Black church tradition is where in the Negro spirituals, you could give voice to that kind of existential pain. Whereas in a lot of contemporary Black churches, it's almost as if they don't want you to talk about your pain. We have to come in and pretend that everything is okay.
Right.
And that's really not helping people to deal with some of those painful realities. And so I'm looking forward to furthering that conversation.